A few weeks ago, I did a comparison of two similarly sounding Fujifilm film simulations, Classic Chrome and Classic Neg, and I wanted to follow that up with another comparison of two more film simulations that sound the same and on first glance might look the same, but they couldn't be further apart, and that's Classic Neg and Nostalgic Neg. And like that last comparison video that I did, I'm not just going to talk about the technical differences, the differences in contrast and color. We're going to go into some differences that a lot of photographers really don't think about when they're choosing between two different film simulations. And I want to start here by saying that I did get in trouble in the last video for not talking about how Classic Neg renders greens. That's a valid point. You can check out this comparison right here between the standard Provia and Classic Neg. Check out how those greens have a lot more blue than yellow in Classic Neg. It's very unique among the film simulations for the way that greens are rendered in Classic Neg. But going back to Classic Neg and Nostalgic Neg, we're first going to start by looking at the contrast between these two film simulations. Across the board, Classic Neg has a lot more contrast than Nostalgic Neg, both in the highlights and in the shadows. That's really evident here, where the highlights are clipped and the shadows are near black when rendering the scene in Classic Neg. But with Nostalgic Neg, those petals retain a lot of the detail, and the shadows are much softer. The only thing I changed between these two photos was the film simulation. There's a big difference in that contrast. This photo has a really bold, contrasty look in Classic Neg, while Nostalgic Neg is softer, but this time it's a little more subtle than the previous example, but you can still tell that there is a lot more contrast in Classic Neg. Check out this example. You can barely see the texture in the horsehair in the shadows with Classic Neg, but when it's rendered in Nostalgic Neg, those shadows become much softer and that texture and color is a lot more visible. Also note how bright the sky is with Classic Neg, and then the contrast in the writers' faces, how different it is between the two film simulations. And when we add Provia into this comparison, that's the standard neutral film simulation, you can see that Nostalgic Neg has even softer contrast in the shadows than Provia. Highlight contrast is more or less the same between the two. The same thing happens indoors. Shadows are much bolder in Classic Neg with more highlight contrast as well. We see that even better when we add Provia into this comparison. So those are the differences in contrast. No matter what you're photographing, you're going to have more contrast using Classic Neg than when you're using Nostalgic Neg. There are some subtle differences based on the initial contrast of the scene, but overall, that's what you're going to get between the two. But now let's look at some of the color differences between Classic Neg and Nostalgic Neg. Those can be a little less drastic. If the photo's already initially warm, it has warm colors, like the background and our subject's clothing here in this photo, you're not going to see huge color shifts in those warmer colors. Both film simulations have warmer shifts, and the red shirt here is almost the exact same color between Classic Neg and Nostalgic Neg. There are some small tonal differences that we just talked about, and the yellow is close too, with again some tonal differences, but for the most part, those warmer colors look the same. And then there's some small color differences throughout the rest of the photo, but both have a very warm look. Let's compare both of these to Provia to see just how much they warm these colors. But what about when the scene isn't already warm, like the last one? Going back to these daisies, you can see the differences in those greens that we talked about earlier. Classic Neg shifts those greens to blue, while Nostalgic Neg shifts those greens to yellow. And that shift is even more apparent when we compare them to Provia. Look how different those greens are between all three, with Provia being the neutral rendition. The white areas, the petals, in Nostalgic Neg have even more yellow than Provia, while in Classic Neg, those whites appear to have some magenta tints. And we talked about that in that last comparison video. Going back to this photo, here again are those magenta shifts in the highlights in the clouds in the sky using classic neg. Nostalgic neg maintains the blues in the sky, but when we add Provia to the mix, you can see how much warmer the sky is in nostalgic neg. So again, we're adding warmth, but the yellow trees in this photo between all three film simulations, the warm colors that already exist, they're very similar between all three. So those are the technical, objective differences between classic neg and nostalgic neg. Classic neg overall has a lot more contrast in both the shadows and the highlights. Nostalgic neg has much softer shadow contrast, especially when compared to Provia. However, the highlight contrast is more or less similar between nostalgic neg and Provia. As far as the colors are concerned, both film simulations do add an overall feeling of warmth, warmer color shifts, but there is that split color toning aspect of classic neg that we see in those cooler colors. But what about the more important differences to your photography? Like, when would you choose one film simulation over the other? I talked about this a lot in the last comparison video, how it's all about the story that you're telling and how you want your viewers to feel when they look at your photo. That's kind of why we choose one film simulation over another. Yeah, the technical differences are important to understand between these two film simulations, but you're not going to walk up to a scene and say, okay, well, this scene has some greens in it, but there's also some warmer colors. So what's nostalgic neg going to do over classic neg? But there are a lot of shadow areas here, so maybe I should switch back. You're not going to do that. That's not very practical. That's just way too much work. What you're going to do is when you approach that scene and you're trying to decide between one of these two film simulations, is you're gonna, now understanding the technical differences, ask yourself how you want that photo to feel. Do you want it to feel bold and edgy like we get with classic neg? Or do you want it to feel softer and maybe a little bit warmer overall, like we get with nostalgic neg, thanks to that reduced contrast? Nostalgic neg can give your pictures the look of photos created in the 1970s, the New American Color movement, hence the nostalgia name. But you can really see that when you start comparing photos of the two film simulations and asking yourself, how do these two film simulations make you feel? Softer, warmer, more playful feelings in nostalgic neg versus the more edgy feelings that we get in classic neg, but with overall warmer tones for both. So I hope that comparison helped you in trying to determine which of these two film simulations to use. If you want to see more comparisons of all of Fujifilm's film simulations in one place, you can check out my free Fujifilm film simulation course. You'll find that at photocourses.link/filmsims. Please let me know if you have any other questions or anything to add. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more great tips like this every week, and we'll see you in the next video.